I want to talk some more about what I'm looking for when I'm cutting up pieces, and I'm in the process on these pieces here that I've got the tree bucked up into sections. You can see this is a piece of pecan I got last week, and what I was looking for, this was a really large pecan, but had one limb and some crotch sections that were kind of gnarly looking on the outside, and I could see some of this patterning in here, which kind of gave me some idea that there might be some figure in there. So I cut it up, and I was right, this is pretty unusual to see in pecan. You get a lot of this figuring in right there, but some of it was pretty far spalted, so this one I'm not going to spalt anymore. And some of these other pieces still have a lot of heartwood in them. They look pretty good. You can see some spalting starting to come in on the edges, and it could probably come in a little bit further. So if I'm going to do that, I need to get them sawn up and waxed up so they can sit out for a little bit longer. So what I wanted to talk about is basically how you process wood getting ready for turning. Cutting them up into blanks, mostly for vessels and hollows. There's a little bit different process for bowls, but there's some similarities to it. The main thing I'm looking at this point is if I'm going to let them sit outside for 6 months, another year or so, I need to cut the pith out to prevent it from cracking up so much. So on this log in particular, this is a good example of where your pith is off center. And so you have basically two options to either slice this in half, or you can cut it down this way. And so it's going to ultimately come out to what you want to make, how much depth in a blank you need. Considering that a lot of these that I've got some depth here. I already cut basically the pith out at that point. I've got a few others, and there are a fair number that are irregular. The pith is not quite on center in this case. I'm probably gonna have one large section on most of these, and then a smaller piece I might, this might be a bowl right here. That might be all the material I have for that. Other pieces like this looks like a crotch was starting to form, so it's probably a good area for something there. So I'm probably going to be a mix of some bowl blanks and mostly hollow blanks, but that's basically the main thing you need to get to at this point, is you need to cut the pith out and get them waxed up, which is what I'm doing today before it gets away from me and then they get too cracked up. So this is a good shot of what I was looking at on the tree before I cut it. You start to have a lot of this swirling and swoops and things like that, and oftentimes when you see that, there's probably going to be figure in the tree. What that does in this case is that's going to make your cutting your blanks a little bit more challenging, because you haven't, for this one, you got this really large depression right here. So that's going to make, turning something out of this one whole piece very difficult. Aside from that, it's a pretty large piece and bigger than I'm going to put in my lathe. So this is a good example of what I was talking about, cutting the pith out, getting it waxed up, and when the day comes that you're ready to turn it, you can then consider which way you want to go with it. Things I look for right now is where I have full continuous depth. I'm probably going to do some natural edge pieces out of this. This is the big area that's going to be concerned. It's probably not going to be usable. So most likely this piece is going to get cut right here, and I'll have a small hollow or a vessel right there, and then that'll leave this section over here as another one, and we'll probably make another cut right there. So most of this and this area is all going to get cut away. If there is sufficient depth, maybe I can see right here that might be a small vessel or something, but that's going to be basically a cut off, and at that point you just kind of get what you can get out of it. But this one in particular, I'm looking at two main pieces whenever I get to it. This will give you some idea why the tree was dying out. This was a really big pecan tree, and I'd say it was probably 4 foot in diameter or so. It was really big, but half of the trunk was basically rotten away, and this was part of one of the crotch sections here. And a lot of you may wonder or look at something like this and think, this is not really good for anything. There's just not much material. A lot of times on these crotches, you're going to get spalting to start first, and you can get a lot of this figure you kind of see coming in here. So even sections like this, I would suggest holding on to. You may be able to, certainly if you're doing pen work, you can cut pen blanks and things like that, but even vessels, sometimes you can get small vessels that are really nice. They don't take a long time to turn. There's probably sufficient thickness in this section right here. So that's, yeah, there's definitely enough thickness right in here for a small hollow. So it's, even pieces like that shouldn't be discarded. So here's how you cut these up. This is what I was talking about before. The pith is off center here. So I want to cut basically along the pith. So you're going to want to start a cut that matches the pith on this side versus the pith on that side. So typically what I like to do is I'll just make a little cut mark on this side to mark where the pith is going to start. And you can see over here, it's further away from the edge of the tree than it was on the opposing side. So your cut's not always going to be parallel with the outside of the tree. So in this case, this is just, I'm going to cut down here, I'm going to cut the pith. This is mostly what I'm after. Seeing this figure start to pop up here. There's still a lot of heartwood that's not too far spalted. Over here, the spalting has gone much further, and I'm probably looking mostly for what's right in this area right here. All right, so let's evaluate what we got here. It's cut all the way through. So we'll start over here because this is the main thing I was looking for. Spalting's coming in from here. That's some nice figure over there. Most of this is still pretty intact. It's more intact on this side than this side. So got some cracking that's starting. That's probably not going too deep. Some wormholes and things like that out here. So I think most of this is going to be good. Something right in here. I will probably cut part of that off and some of this off to mount that right there. So this, as far as a blank goes, is fine. I'll leave it just like this. I'll wax up both ends and I'll set it aside. This is the other side of the log, and spalting's not too bad. It's got some meat still right there. The big issue is that there's not as much material over here. So most likely, I've got a little knob right here. I'm thinking that there's probably a vessel right in here somewhere. So chances are I will wax this up as it is and just leave it like that. But when the day comes that I'm going to mount this thing and turn it, I will cut this off and use this section over here. I like to leave them all the way intact because even if they stay outside and they're waxed, you're still going to get some cracking in on the ends, and some species that can be pretty extensive. So it gives you some latitude to chop material off. So if I needed to come this way some, I'm still more in the center and probably the furthest away from the cracks. So the cracking may compromise a couple of inches over here, and that still leaves me something that's usable in the middle. If I go ahead and chop this right now, then I'm just hoping completely this doesn't crack up so much that it's unusable. All right, so I wanted to share this. This is a real treat. I don't typically come across this, and this is even more rare at least in me anyway. Pecan. I would expect to see something like this in maple, basically around here, and part of the reason why I work with so much spalting is that I don't typically find a lot of this. So this is really, really nice. This is a lot of fiddleback in here, and that's going to be pretty awesome. I'm really excited to see how that's going to turn out. So that kind of goes to show you, if you're out scavenging and you're looking at trees, and this is one of the things that I like to do. I particularly harvest a lot of crotches and turn out of them. Vessel-wise, they're a lot more unstable wood, so it's not always the greatest for bowl work, but vessels, it can be really good. People don't like to split crotches for firewood, and so oftentimes they're always hanging around. Every tree's got them. You don't need big burls and everything all the time to really get some nice figure. Another thing I've noticed is crotches almost always spalt first. It's probably because they're areas that catch water, and that's just where that happens. But anyway, the point is that anywhere in a tree where you think of a tree grange is always going to run straight. Anytime you start to see in the outside of the tree, you start to see these swirls or something about the tree grew funny, there's almost always going to be something behind there. It may not be very extensive. It could really be. So in this case, you're starting to see this swirl right there, and you look what's underneath it. So that's a really good example of stuff that's very nice. In this piece, it's not a lot, but that can still be some excellent wood to do to work with. So in this case, knowing how pecan is, this may not dry completely flat. It may distort a bit, but for what I do, that's okay. I don't mind the distortions after it's turned. That just kind of comes with the territory. Unless you want to leave this wood sit out for years for its thickness to dry before you turn it, then go right ahead. But oftentimes there's a lot of stresses internally, and so if it's dry, it may still move then too. All right, this will be a good example of deciding what you want to do. You want to do bowl work, you want to do vessels, something like that. So for vessels, I'm typically looking for a section that is roughly more cubular, essentially. We're talking more thickness, more depth, and this is a good example right here. So on this one, the pith is offset, so it's not in the center, and I can just slice either side. So this is a good example of deciding, do you want to make bowls or do you want to do vessels? Because if I am looking at this for bowl work, I would probably make my cut down the center. So I'll have a bowl over here and a bowl on this side. Vessel wise, the pith line is running fairly parallel to the outside of the tree. So I'm going to get a section that is roughly a cross section that's roughly more square than long and rectangular. And that's going to give me more flexibility for pieces in vessels. So something you're talking that has more depth. Another thing to consider is the outside shape of the tree. There's a lot of curls, some depressions here, and you can see the bark's kind of swirling, so this is probably dipping down some too. It's not uniform. There's going to be a lot of irregularity on this. So if you do bowls, then you kind of have to account for that. So chances are, with the depth here and knowing that your contours are moving around, this might be a really good candidate for a natural edge bowl. It might be, so you kind of have to weigh two decisions. And is there enough depth here that you can shave some of that off to do a finished edge bowl, and the bottom of the bowl will be here and you get your flat. Most of the rim is up this way, up towards the top here. There's not a lot of depth, but you might get something. Like I was saying earlier, I'm gravitating towards bowls that have at least 3 inches in depth, preferably more. I think they tend to be a little bit more marketable, particularly for if you can get some larger diameter out of it. If I cut it this way, the outside is a little bit more regular. It won't be as big of a bowl, and my diameter won't be really big over here, but this could be something really deep. So a lot of it you just kind of have to play with in mind. What do you think you're going to get the best option out of? So for me, I'm looking at vessels. So I'm going to make my cut here. I got this large section to work from, and then I have flexibility to either do small vessels or I can do a natural edge bowl, and we'll just see how it goes and what the contours are. So this is a lot of the things you kind of have to weigh in mind. You kind of have to think about what's the end product. See, this pith is on this side, is really far over. So if this was more in the center, I would have, this would probably be a better candidate for doing bowl work out of, but in this case, not today. Another consideration that weighs into this too is seeing how some of this other grain was coming out, is that I suspect that this is going to end up being really nice. So I would really hate to shave that in half just to get a bowl, and you'll get really figured grain just part of on this side and not so much on this side. So it would be much nicer, in my opinion, to keep a lot of this figure that's running through here all in one intact piece that spreads from this side to this side. But you can, even though this is starting to spalt in here, you can still see some of these waves up on this side and then coming up in here too. So if you do a vessel, a lot of that in the upper half here is going to be visible, and maybe not so much coming down here, but certainly if you cut this down that way for bowl work, you're going to get grain in only half, this figure grain only in half the bowl. The other thing I noticed here is, see if we can get a good close-up. All right, so you got a crack starting to form. So the core of this tree is starting to delaminate. So it runs from here, works all the way around to here. And if you're doing bowls, that's pretty much going to guarantee that piece of wood's no longer usable. Because I've seen this on the outside of the tree and on the outside of this log, and a lot of times it just runs all the way through. So that's another thing to consider, because if you're doing bowl stuff, you don't want any of that at all. That's going to ensure that this is firewood for you and the loss of labor.